Hello team and welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MS Pearce. This is a Ukraine war frontline update. You don't even know it's an ATP Geopolitics video, do you? Because I've just noticed I haven't even turned that on. I mean, I could be anyone talking from anywhere. But now you know it's definitely ATP Geopolitics. This is a fact. Let's get to the front line. Before we do so, please check out the key to the map. Pause the video and you can look to see what the lines mean. It's not good looking viewing today in terms of looking at me. That's never good looking viewing. But in terms of looking at the map, if you're pro-Ukrainian, the pins are predominantly, or indeed entirely, involving Russian movements forward. Now, I have to thank JR who's done the mapping today. What an absolute legend. This is, I think, reflective of the fact that Russia are pushing right across the front lines, particularly pushing in Avdiivka and Mariinka, although there are no, well, there appears to be no movement in the last 24 hours, as according to my mapping sources. I think Avdiivka is incredibly intense in terms of fighting. I think also Bakhmut is incredibly intense too, particularly around the Bodanivka area, but also Klishchivka to the south of Bakhmut. And as you can see, some other movements as well for the Russians. Nowhere else on the line down past Mariinka. But let's go to the Institute for the Study of War, American military think tank. And before we go to the different areas of the front line, it's worth taking this into account. So this is from Russian Foreign Ministry spokesperson Maria Zakharova, and I, in my news piece this morning, showed you an excerpt from Putin's announcement that he was running for president the other day, and he was speaking to someone. I don't know who it was. It wasn't Zakharova, I don't think, but there was some other dignitary or some other important Kremlin woman that was asking him about the borders and talking about how the Western people want the borders for Russia to be near Rostov. In other words, the Russian border, the internationally recognized Russian border. And she was saying, but of course, we want the border to be nearer to Krakow, which is Poland, and Krakow is there, which you would assume means the Ukrainian border. But if it's maybe, I don't know, part of Poland. I mean, this is what they are. They're in some imperialistic frame of mind, the Russians at the moment. So we need to be paying attention to what important Russian people are saying, to what the propagandists are saying, because this gives you a proper understanding of really what their intentions are. Now, I've said previously, as indeed Russian generals have said, that their minimal intentions are going to be taking this land bridge up to, I keep doing that, don't I? I don't know how to get rid of that. So let's select it and delete it. Do apologize. Anyway, these generals have said, look, we're going to have a land bridge all the way to Transnistria, and indeed Transnistria as well. So what the Russian generals are assuming is that they are going to take all of the Ukrainian land up to Transnistria and indeed have Transnistria. So the Ukrainians would then have no access to the Black Sea because all of this would be under Russian control. That land bridge then would allow Russia unbridled access to Crimea and the deep sea warm water port of Sevastopol. But of course, that's assuming that Russia wouldn't stop bombing the crap out of Sevastopol. The Ukraine wouldn't keep hammering Sevastopol from a distance. So, but that aside, the kind of minimalist intentions of Russia, I think, would be that, and the maximalist intentions would still be in taking the whole of Ukraine, as you can hear from some of the propagandists and some of these important people. Well, the Russian Foreign Ministry spokesperson Maria Zakharova has emphasized that Russia's maximalist objectives in Ukraine have not changed, repeating the Kremlin's demand for full Ukrainian political capitulation and Kyiv's acceptance of Russia's military and territorial demands rather than suggesting any willingness to negotiate seriously. In a written interview with AFP, Zakharova claimed that a, quote, comprehensive, sustainable and fair resolution in Ukraine can only happen if the West stops, quote, pumping up the armed forces of Ukraine with weapons, and that Ukraine surrenders Russia's claimed Ukrainian territory and withdraw its troops, presumably from the Ukrainian territory Russia claims to have annexed. Zakharova emphasized the Kremlin's long-standing claim that Russia invaded Ukraine for demilitarization, denazification, and to ensure the rights of the Russian-speaking citizens in Ukraine. The Kremlin has consistently used the term denazification as a code for the removal of the elected government of Ukraine and its replacement by some government the Kremlin regards as acceptable, i.e. regime change. Demilitarization would obviously leave Ukraine permanently at Russia's mercy, and Zakharova's comments clearly highlight the fact that the initial goals of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, as set out by the President Putin in February last year, have not changed, and that Putin does not intend to end this war unless his maximalist objectives have been accomplished. Her demand that Ukraine withdraw its troops from Russian territory as a necessary prerequisite for the resolution of the war suggests that Russia's maximalist objectives include controlling the entirety of the 4 oblasts it has illegally annexed parts of. And of course, that means that they would want to control at least all of them. So it depends how you interpret those maximalist aims, because if you want the full denazification, demilitarization of Ukraine, that means essentially you've got a Ukrainian puppet, a Russian puppet government installed in Kiev, that you have the whole of the Donbass, you've got Kharkiv, Luhansk, Donetsk, and Zaporizhia, and really, although they didn't not Kharkiv, but the whole of Luhansk, but then you would assume parts of Kharkiv that they are sort of looking to control there, and the whole of Kherson would be under Russian control with Ukrainian troops pulling out, so increasing this area. So it's just Russia are still inside Ukraine with all those troops, intending to take it to at least that level. A government change and a demilitarization would be, no more Ukrainian army. So the whole of Ukraine just would be, at the very least, all of Ukraine would be a puppet state, a vassal state of Russia, and you would have a large swathe of territory here would be direct Russian controlled. It would be, part of the Russian Federation, or just a whole lot part of the Russian Federation. Don't ignore what they're saying here. Okay, and in that context, they are still, attacking along a lot of these lines. But how far can they get? Well, as I've said previously, the good news about where Russia are at the moment is, and where Ukraine are at the moment, although Ukraine is struggling for boots on the ground, they haven't, fully nationally mobilized. And neither Russia, on the other hand, but Russia have expended vast amounts of personnel and equipment, taking relatively small amounts of land. I mean, we're talking about hundreds of meters in Avdiivka. You zoom out of there, and actually this is a small amount of even what their minimalist gains are. So if their minimalist gains include all of this Odessa area right up to Transnistria, Russia being able to take all of this now in Ukraine's present situation with the amount of, the improved equipment that Ukraine has and the air defense systems that they have, and there's stuff coming online with F-16s and increased artillery ammunition production across the world in support of Ukraine. I don't think that Russia can remotely achieve even the kind of minimalist goals that they have, let alone the maximalist ones. So anyway, sorry, there's a bit of a long preamble there. I'll try and just scoot over the front line then. So Ukrainian ground forces spokesperson Fitchio, and we're talking about the northeast here, stated that poor weather, including freezing rain and sub-zero temperatures, have led to a decrease in the Russian assaults in the Kupiansk and Liman directions. Another Russian mail blogger claimed that the past week Ukrainian forces stabilized the front line near Ivanivka, and that Russian forces failed to break through Ukrainian defenses near Sinkivka due to the Ukrainian defenses and their minefields. So this is up in the northeast, where we have a stabilization around Yahidny and Ivanivka here. The Ukrainians indeed took some land back. It's been a bit of back and forth there, as it has been in a number of places here, including around Sinkivka and Liman Pershi. But the Russians have failed to take ground at at Sinkivka area due to Ukrainian minefields there. That's from Russian sources. And they've also claimed, Russian sources, that Ukrainian forces conducted ground attacks along the Kupiansk-Svatovo-Kremenna line yesterday and made gains. A Russian mill blogger claimed that Ukrainian forces were somewhat successful in Serebyansky forest area in the past week, which I showed on the map, and we have seen that in the forest area to the north of Dubrova, or sort of around here possibly, and maybe other successes inside the forest. But we do have some gains, as according to Syriac maps here, inside the forest area. Although they haven't released their kind of individual tweets and bits of information on these gains, this is just directly from their mapping. So some gains, and fairly significant gains, I guess, in the Serebyansky forest for the Russians, if that is indeed true. Pushing back the Ukrainians. Well, actually, let's measure this gain. And bear in mind that the Ukrainians had some gains in this general area recently as well. So that's about 1.3 kilometers. In the context of this war, that's relatively good advance in a single sort of day. But of course, that could be over the last few days, I guess. But yeah, claims that the Russians have taken some land in the forest area. We'll wait to see if that is borne out by other sources. No other claims to that area yet. And then around the Vasily area, Andrew Perpetua sort of showing some Russian gains there that now go over the Surat map lines here for the Russians in that area. So they are equalizing this front line across here, with perhaps the exception of Rostolivka, although Surat maps had that being taken, and indeed Deep State map in yellow had that being taken and then reversed it to show that the Ukrainians still had the Russians pushed back somewhat there. But the Russians having some success in this northern area. I know some of you are saying, why are the yellow lines much thicker and more visible than the blue and red lines? It's so weird what Google does when we transfer the mapping from Google Maps to Google Earth. And there's nothing I can do. I can't make these red and blue lines thicker. And it's really frustrating because I want to, believe you me. So as we come down towards the south and around the corner here, around Dubovo-Vasilivka area, we can see that the Russians are making some fairly widespread gains, as according to, well, really all the mappers in this area, particularly north of Bakhmut in the Bodanivka area, where you can see that the Russians have increased their territorial control along this road. In fact, do I have all the roads selected? No, I don't. So the 00506, that's not the road, that's the railway just north of the road there. The Russians are moving along the tree lines and the railway there, as well as having some success pushing along this higher ground overlooking Bakhmut here. And indeed, Andrew Perpetua and Deep State maps agree with Surat maps now that the Russians are right at the edge of this dirt track here, which means they already have sort of purchasing or are challenging the sort of trench lines and this higher ground. They're quite a way along this higher ground as it overlooks Bakhmut. And this was the area that I was talking about recently, where there's actually footage of Ukrainian snipers, working from up here around the dirt track and over towards the northeast, I think, of that dirt track. As we go this way, the Russians are now in control of that, as according to all the mappers. This is a concern. I mean, it's more than a concern, it's kind of happened already. The Ukrainians have broadly lost control of this area near Bodanivka, and one would assume it's some kind of operational withdrawal. We know that they are pretty well dug in Chasiv Yar. Chasiv Yar would be very difficult for the Russians to take, as we were talking about after they had the initial, I say the initial culmination, when Wagner pulled out of Bakhmut. They handed it over to conventional forces, and then the Ukrainians took the advantage to counterattack in the area. Although they didn't commit huge forces to this area, they did have that success, and I think they probably capitalized on that, found it a bit opportunistic, and then carried on pushing as the Russians were beaten back. I guess I wouldn't say they were caught off guard, but the Ukrainians certainly had a lot of momentum. But then, as the Ukrainians were finding they had to draw people away for Avdiivka, and they basically culminated themselves, that has allowed the Russians to, as Andrew Perpetua say, effectively finish off their initial counterattack or their offensive from in this area. So when Wagner culminated and pulled out, that wasn't the end of where they wanted to. I mean, ideally, they just want to keep pushing forever, right? And keep pushing, and have the forces to do that. But of course, that's entirely unrealistic. So at certain points in time, forces will generally have to culminate in order to reconstitute, get their regenerate their forces that they've lost and get their supplies back, etc., do some rotations, so on and so forth. The Russians did that, and the Ukrainians then hit. Then the Ukrainians have culminated. Now the Russians are hitting back. So this is the whole thing about, it's all good and well being on the offensive, but what happens is you can exhaust yourself on the offensive. Look at Avdiivka, where I've been saying that the Russians have lost so much that culmination is very dangerous and can look like, if they do culminate soon, it would look like a Pyrrhic victory, which is taking that ground, but at such high cost that then you can be counterattacked and lose significantly. So that victory ends up being more of a disaster than a gain. What might go on here? Well, I don't know, but the Russians are certainly trying to finish the job. Now, really, the job is the whole of Ukraine, but in more immediate terms, it's going to be Chasiv Yar here, which is kind of the place that they would have been wanting originally, because ideally they want to be taking Konstantinivka, Druzhkivka, Kramatorsk, and Slovyansk, Liman, and Siversk as well. All of this whole semicircle is what they want, but they can't do that without Bakhmut, and after Bakhmut, it's really Chasiv Yar. So that's where they're heading towards, but the Ukrainians are going to be very well defended around there, and it'll be very difficult, I think, for the Russians to take Chasiv Yar without another Bakhmut of attrition style offensive. Now, around further to south, actually, really to the west of Bakhmut, we have some gain in an area we haven't seen gains for an awful long time, which is directly west of the city itself. Surat maps and Deep State map having some Russian gains there, north of where we saw it in Klishchivka. So we're not down in this trench area in Klishchivka, where there's a bit of a difference of opinion with the mappers there. But this is up around Bakhmut, and again, this is a case of expanding towards Chasiv Yar and finishing off what I think they were originally planning. It's certainly going to be something to keep an eye on, see how far the Russians can push it there and what the Ukrainians are willing to do in terms of defending these positions. My opinion would be right now it's not that important that Ukraine fight over every meter here, and they should really do an operational withdrawal to defensive lines here, whilst trying to attrit the Russians to the maximal amount. And the same would go for down here. If they have genuinely lost these trench lines to overlooking Klishchivka, then you would want to be pulling out of Klishchivka and forming defensive lines further to the west. We'll see how that turns out. And then in fact, actually, before we get there, let's look at the only tweet from Syriac is this tiny bit of land. So we know that Syriac Maps has changed their mapping to have a lot more Russian gains than that. But they initially said, and this is going back almost a day, that the Russian army made small advances along the railway in the direction of Bodonivka. And we also have the Institute for the Study of War talking about Bakhmut, saying geolocated footage published 2 days ago indicates Russian forces advanced north and southeast of Bodonivka. So we'll have a look at those advances. And this is the Bodonivka advances that's communicated here by Global War Monitor, saying bad news for Ukraine in the Bodonivka area. Russia has advanced back to the original positions they held in May before the localized Ukrainian counterattack in the area. Russia's also entered and now occupies the northern part of Kromovo, if not the whole village. And then the geolocated footage is the Ukrainian Special Purpose Brigade, 1st Special Purpose Brigade, destroying a BMD-2 in the Bodonivka area. So this BMD-2 is operating here, geolocated to that position. So that is on the very edge, and that's probably what is giving Surat Maps the rationale to extend the lines to there. Now, the difference between Surat Maps and Andrew Perpetua's mapping is something that he has very explicitly talked about, and this is a really good example of that. So he has criticised Suriyat maps and, well, mappers in general, pro-Russian mappers, for bringing their Russian defensive lines to a position where there only needs to be one Russian human being. So one Russian soldier, if they'd seen a Russian soldier in this tree line, on the corner of this tree line, then they say, right, the Russians control that. Rather than that just being a Russian and then that Russian getting shot and then Ukrainians controlling that tree line. Rather than like surveying it, looking at the data over some extended period of time, making sure it's not just a reconnaissance group that's in the area, so on and so forth. So Suriyat maps will look to very quickly show Russian gains if there's any hint of Russian presence there, and Andrew Perpetua will not do that. So that BMD being blown up in this area is probably a good example of Suriyat maps then saying, yep, so the Russians control that, rather than that being an attack, then being repelled and then going back to their original positions, and this clearly being a grey zone. So Andrew Perpetua still has that as a grey zone, and he's a lot more conservative, and that's probably a lot more justified there. Anyway, that was what that geolocation showed. A Russian mill blogger claimed that elements of the Russian 200th Motorized Rifle Brigade advanced near Bodonivka and amplified alleged reports from unspecified Ukrainian military observers that Russian forces have advanced up to 580 meters northeast of Bodonivka. So there's a claim that they've advanced almost 600 meters, but it is an amplified claim from an unevidenced source. Right. Okay, now we're coming to Avdiivka proper, and the ISW says of Avdiivka, geolocated footage published on the 9th shows that the Russians advance at Stepova, and Russian mill bloggers claim that Russian forces advance there and north of the coke plants, as well as advancing in the Avdiivka industrial zone southeast. So this is Stepova up here and then down there, but there are no changes to the mappers, so that might be an unjustified claim. The geolocation is here at the same place near the coke plant. The Ukrainian Shadow unit drone drop unbelievable Russian losses. The Russian losses in Avdiivka from a whole host of sources have for a long time shown just such fundamentally high casualty rates and equipment losses for the Russians. That is, behind where we've thought they've been for some time. So I don't think that shows an advance, certainly from our mapping for the last 24, 48 hours. But ISW indicating that is a Russian advance. It's worth noting, and I did mention this from the Guardian's daily update today, that Russia has unleashed a new a major offensive in Avdiivka, apparently, according to the Ukrainians, with 610 artillery shellings reported there over the last 24 hours. Quote, the enemy launched yesterday massive assault actions with the support of armoured vehicles in Avdiivka and Mariinka directions. So it's not just here, but also Mariinka. The fierce battles continue. Our fighters are firmly holding on to defences. And then the UK's MOD intelligence update said that the most intense fighting is taking place in Avdiivka and Mariinka, which has seen likely 40% of all the combat engagements recently, including a lot of dismounted infantry assaults from Storm Z penal units. So that is that. The ISW says the Ukrainian General Staff reported Ukrainian forces repelled at least 39 Russian attacks in all of the areas around Bakhmut, so that's up near Novobakhmutivka, but also Severny as well, and all the way around there. 39 attacks is a lot relatively to recent activity. So that goes to what the British intelligence update is saying, that there's an awful lot of attacks happening in this area. A Russian mill blogger characterized the Avdiivka front as a lighter version of the Bakhmut meat grinder, suggesting that Russian forces are conducting attritional infantry-led frontal assaults on Ukrainian fortifications in Avdiivka at high cost. So if the Russians are admitting this is like Bakhmut 2.0, but not quite as bad, then that is suggesting that Bakhmut was really bad. So it's always important to do kind of inference and deduction for what people say. So the inference from that is that Bakhmut was bad, and that this is bad, but not quite as bad. And if that's coming from a Russian source, you can probably infer from that it probably is as bad as Bakhmut. So these are both bad meat grinders, and all the other sources, like Frontline sources, like a video this morning from a unit saying we had 70 the other day, and now we've got 14. And another video I showed where there's just one guy on his own showing his entire unit just killed around him. Somewhere around Bakhmut, all these dead bodies in the snow. Obviously, I couldn't show that, but it is bad in Avdiivka. But anyway, that's the geolocation there. We have another geolocation, I think, here, which is Russian military once again raise a flag. Sorry, that's going down into Mariinka. We'll get there in a second. So no changes to the front line there, but it is going to be very tough fighting. And then we have Mariinka here with some gains being shown by Andrew Perpetua's mapping, getting towards that maximalist mapping from some time ago from Surat maps that was in line with a flag that was put on a building, but there was lots of there were some criticisms of that claim because it happened just after a blizzard. Very easy to plonk a flag and then run away. It didn't really show they controlled that area. And it was on a very outskirts of Mariinka. And then straight away, Russian sources were discrediting the claims of that. But Surat maps didn't wind back their mapping. And what we're probably going to see going forward is the Russians just inching forward and taking that ground. And it probably will get to where Surat maps has the control line. But that's unlikely as to where it is now. Certainly hasn't been recently, and that's coming from Russian sources as much as it is from people like Andrew Perpetua. And here we have a flag that is raised, flying. This is someone actually planting the flag, so there is at least I'm pretty sure in this, is there not? I thought there was someone standing next to it. Yeah, so you've got, so you have two people standing next to that flag. They have actually put that flag up, and that's been geolocated to here, rather than it being, obviously someone has to put a flag up. So, but it was just that one standing in that building after that blizzard. But let's see where that flag is and see if that helps us at all in, trying to work out who is correct with their mapping. Yeah, so that flag is again right on the outskirts. And the previous, I think it was this house there that had the flag on previously. So it could well be that the Russians, that actually, it's getting towards Surat maps lines being more correct now. That's at least a grey zone, isn't it? If Russians are getting there and planting flags, you don't know whether that was taken down soon after. You don't know what the chronology of that is, but it's not looking good for the Ukrainians in Mariinka, that's for sure. And then finally, just going back to Avdiivka in general, but I don't need to show this on the map. During one of the assaults on Avdiivka, Russian soldiers lost a VPK Ural and a BTR-90. So BTR-90s are these 8-wheeled, much more modern version of the APC. First documented loss of its type, so there aren't that many in existence. And it's an improved version of the BTR-80, and back in 2013 that cost $340,000. So goodness knows what it costs now. If I'm not wrong, the BTR-90 is a prototype and were not made. 12 were made, says someone. So there's really not many of these. So if you're seeing a kind of prototype vehicle on the front lines, the question is, what does that tell you? And to me, that says they are desperate for vehicles because they're bringing their prototypes. If you start seeing like T-14 Armatas on the front line, then you know Russia are really properly desperate for vehicles. So I think that possibly signifies that it's been so bad in Avdiivka that they're drafting in vehicles that they wouldn't otherwise draft in. And we're already seeing a shift from BMP-1s to much later BMPs and BMDs. And so that signifies that they're probably having to fix up stored vehicles much more fundamentally than just polishing them off, actually fixing them up properly, almost rebuilding them. And if they're having to rebuild them, they're going to choose their latest ones to rebuild rather than rebuild an old BMP-1. And I think that's what's going on there. But seeing vehicles like that, I think, is a worry for for Russia. Now, with regard to what's going on along the south, we have global war monitors saying that north of Novoprokopivka and between there and Robotyne, the Russians have taken back some land. That's really sort of confirming or reiterating what was said yesterday in this area there. It looks like the Russians may well be in charge of this trench line here, or they are fighting over it at the moment. That's the alien. It's got a couple of zigzags coming off there that makes it look like an alien's head with antenna. That's what I call it. But anyway, that was fiercely fought over for a long time by the Ukrainians. They eventually took that, then were pressuring Novoprokopivka, occasionally got into the northern outskirts of Novoprokopivka, but were basically unable to go across all this flat land without being seen very easily and hammered by the Russian defenses sitting here. And now the Russians are pushing back and are having some success in taking some of the tree lines and trench lines to the north of their before Robotyne. Some were claiming that they got into Robotyne and then were eventually repelled, and that is, still, I think, pretty much accepted as a theory. That's what did happen, but quite where they are exactly now, I don't know. But it's looking challenging there. But as I said to Rick the Ukrainian, I wouldn't worry too much about the Russians taking back. It's a kick in the teeth when you fight so hard for Robotyne and then a month later it's then taken back by the Russians. But all the Ukrainians need to be concentrating on, territory kind of means nothing in the immediacy. It means everything eventually. Like, of course, you want the whole of Ukraine back, but what's the sole important thing now is attrition of Russian capacity in terms of equipment and personnel, and thus capability. So if the Ukrainians, while ceding ground to the Russians, are able to attrit them, as we have seen in Avdiivka, at those kind of rates, then Russia will be committing military suicide. So I wouldn't worry about, it gets depressing when you look at all these pins on the map being the wrong color if you're pro-Ukrainian. But actually, I've got to the point where, that's not important. It's the attrition ratios. Just concentrate on the attrition ratios. And if they start getting towards parity on a consistent basis, then you've got to worry. Because if it's parity, Russia will win. If it's not parity, if Ukraine can attrit the Russians, ideally at 4 or 5 to 1, but 3 to 1, then the Russians will run out of equipment. Okay, finally, Krinky. Sorry, this has been a long one today, as is usually the case with me. So Mariinka, slight against there. Sorry, I didn't do that in the ISW. So right before we get there, gains towards Novoprokopivka in the ISW. That there are claimed. It is claimed that there are poor weather conditions and ice, and that's impeding Russian and Ukrainian ground attacks and armored vehicle movement near Verbove. So possibly why we might not see as many pins around here as we see elsewhere is because the conditions might locally just be worse in the Zaporizhia area. And indeed, that's what is claimed in the ESW. Russian mill bloggers claimed the poor weather there around Verbove. Some Russian mill bloggers claim the overall number of Ukrainian assaults in the area has recently decreased due to the recommitment of select Ukrainian troops to Avdiivka, something we've heard of elsewhere as well. Avdiivka seems to be the place where Ukraine are concentrating on attriting the Russians as much as possible. Russian sources additionally noted that the ground has mostly frozen around Verbove and that fighting is ongoing in forest areas. One mill blogger stated that Ukrainian forces are still managing to operate combat helicopters along the Robotyne Verbove line. Here, okay, so that's Robotyne. We're now going to go to Krinky and the Dnipro River, and there's a couple of maybe contradictory sort of claims. Reporting from Ukraine is very positive about what's going on in Krinky. So if you look at their videos recently, it's all about attriting the Russians a lot around here, and I think that is happening. But I think the Ukrainians are going to be under quite a bit of pressure. And there's some claims that the Russians have got back into the center of Krinky. So here we have the Griffin unit, the 501st Separate Marine Battalion, destroying a Russian infantry group in the center of Krinky. And I won't show you, but infantry group there getting sort of targeted. This has been, I can't speak to the quality of this geolocation, but someone here has geolocated it. It's no one I usually rely on, has geolocated it to this position. And that's right in the center. So if you've got Russian soldiers there, then that is a worry. Now, these Russian soldiers are getting taken out, and we do have reports of things being very tough for the Russians there. I can't speak to when that footage came out, but if the Russians are there, then that is a bit of an issue. Although these lines are Russian defensive lines, and so almost all of this is contested grey zone. So it is not that Ukraine are controlling these houses here. It is worrying if you see the Russians, advancing that close to the Ukrainians. So the Ukrainian defensive lines are broadly going to be, the edge of Krinky, like this road here. So just be wary of that. Tim White says reports from the left bank and Dnipro and Occupy Kherson are that Ukraine's troops on a march again. So again, this is what I'm talking about, contradictory. You just want to work out what's going on. The report actually comes from pro-Russian blogger. They say that the famed 104th Airborne has been breached again, and more criticism for Teflon Teplinsky. And what the translation is Vanguard units 104th Airborne Division broke through the area of the settlement of Krinky. The enemy entered the operational space. Now General Teplinsky does not respond in any way to requests for support from the 104th Airborne Division. So yeah, the Ukrainians might be having some success. We know that they're having success in terms of what their drones are doing. So Ukrainian forces repelled a large-scale counterattack on a bridgehead across the Dnipro near Krinky, with 4 armored vehicles of the Russian forces being destroyed in the process. We know that it's difficult for the Russians to get equipment to the area because it kind of gets telegraphed. They end up having to come down these straight roads, which are being spotted by Ukrainian drones very easily. And the Ukrainians just have so many drones operating around here that the Russian equipment just gets fairly consistently destroyed. I showed you that footage from this morning of the sound of those drones in the air, and that was pretty scary. There just sounds like there are drones all over the place, and yeah, tough for both sides. But I think the Ukrainians have the drone advantage locally here, but they still haven't been able to translate that into expanding the bridgehead either here or at Pidstepny, as far as I can work out. So I think it's still very challenging for the Ukrainians, and it's on a bit of a knife edge. Anyway, there you go. That's my somewhat long Frontline update today. I really appreciate all your support. Please like, subscribe, and share. Thank you very much for watching. Take care, and I'll speak soon.